atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Jay Carson, well-known defender of freedom in the Northeast Ohio area. And I'm joined today not by my usual counterpart, Professor Emeritus Michael Peranowski, but Justin Holmes, Professor of Political Science at Northern Iowa University. Hi, Justin.
Morning, Jay.
So before we start, we want to thank, first of all our listeners, all our supporters, and give out a special shout-outs today to new Patreon supporter, Amy. It's a three-letter name, and I bungled it, Justin. That's the kind of morning I'm having. And also letters. our new trial Patreon supporter, Doritos All Day, who I'm hoping that's not who I think it might be. But we'll see, right? There's lots of people. There's lots of other people who like Doritos, Jason. Justin.
I'm happy that he's dipped into his snack budget to try us out.
Yes. But with that, so our first story today is going to be Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the U.S., which I think you can say probably maybe came away with kind of a mixed bag. Zelensky visited the United States last week to speak to the UN General Assembly, as well as to pitch a victory plan to President Biden. While here, he also visited a munitions plant in Pennsylvania, which is key to making the munitions that are keeping Ukraine in the fight. He visited it, however, with a delegation of Democrats, no Republicans present. And also referred in one statement to J.D. Vance's proposals or statements about Ukraine as too radical. Vance had said that Ukraine might have to accept some sort of a settlement allowing Russian forces or Russia to maintain territory of the Ukraine. Donald Trump, not to be missed in all this, called Volodymyr Zelensky the greatest salesman on earth. Now, while that typically might be seen as a compliment coming from Donald Trump, I don't think he meant it that way, but also accused Zelensky of not being reasonable in some sort of settlement effort. Now, in fairness to Zelensky, it's not clear that Vladimir Putin, who's not your typical settlement offer kind of guy, has offered any sort of settlement or serious discussion that Zelensky might be in any position to negotiate or accept. So with all that, Justin, I'll turn to you. Your thoughts on Zelensky's trip to the United States and the future of U.S. aid to Ukraine.
So I think it's a little bit of an odd visit in a lot of ways for him to be here, in the midst of a presidential campaign and to be sort of, there with people largely of one side. But it does sort of speak to the way that this issue has really split along partisan lines. Trump clearly is not a big fan of Zelensky, not a big fan of Ukraine, et cetera. And that really seems to have sort of radiated out. We've got sort of this shift, I think, under him in the Republican Party, somewhat to a more isolationist, point of view as far as foreign policy. When I see kind of this situation, I think back to kind of, the justification for going to war with Iraq when they invaded Kuwait. And we've basically flipped the parties here, more or less. I mean, there was, broad bipartisan support, I suppose then, but, certainly Republicans wouldn't back down from a scenario like this. And I think it's analogous, in a lot of ways. But, we have this scenario here now where, suddenly a lot of Republicans are skeptical of aid, sort of following Trump's lead, I think. And a lot of the public is, where certainly, a lot of Republicans are not real happy about sending aid, sending money, et cetera. But even, there is sort of this, and I don't know if this is enough to shift votes, but, there's always been this kind of, young liberal anti-war in general, kind of position that I'm seeing kind of a lot of dissatisfaction there in terms of, American policy on Ukraine. I think the challenge becomes, what do you do about it? Ultimately, I mean, this is a huge, sort of geopolitical thing, and geopolitical thing. That's a great technical term
Right.
in the morning. But I don't know that there's a clear answer here.
Well, let me interject. I mean, there are some voices who have said that, listen, Donald Trump is it's not a matter of there's a real difference in policy here. Donald Trump is just saying the quiet part out loud or being truthful in that his evaluation, his geopolitical evaluation, that any settlement end to this war would probably necessarily end in Putin holding on to some portion of Ukraine, whether it's Crimea, which he seized earlier, or other portions. Without wading into whether that's the right or wrong solution or the right or wrong analysis, I think there are a lot of folks who say, listen, that's sort of the de facto Biden position, which is, you can say that the Biden administration has been supportive of Ukraine, but at the same time, not supportive of a total victory. For example, limiting certain weapon systems and the use of weapon systems and where they can be used and so forth. So it's sort of been the Biden policy, if you were to describe it, was sort of a not, don't lose, but different from what Zelensky is seeking, which is a victory plan. All that said, I mean, setting aside all the politics of this, I think there's something to be said for Zelensky of, look, he has to take sort of the Churchillian stance, right? I mean, what else are you going to do? Your country's been invaded, and you can't go around campaigning, especially in foreign countries, talking about how you're going to cut a deal. So I think his position on this is sound. I think he ought to keep saying, listen, we're going to win. Because again, what else can you say? And also, I think from any standpoint, and this is just observational from my end. This isn't because no party really seems to be making this case, or no candidate seems to be making this case, is if you're to concede the idea that as a matter of geopolitical reality, you're going to end up with some sort of a settlement where Putin holds some portion of Ukraine. You still, the better deal you get is by giving the Ukrainians everything they want right now, as soon as they want, when they want it, giving them a better bargaining position, as opposed to undercutting them with sort of a promise of, look, we might be pulling out soon, so you might as well try to get the best deal you can. But that's just my sense.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think broadly, I mostly agree with you on that. The challenge there, I think, I think in Putin and Zelensky, I mean, you have stubborn for different reasons. With Zelensky being a justified stubborn,
right?
Would be sort of my sense.
You're invading my country.
I mean, stubborn's often a pejorative, but sometimes it's good to be stubborn, and that feels like a scenario where being stubborn is sensible.
Well, and certainly we would not. I can't imagine any nation, certainly not ours, would ever tolerate a. For example, could we say, well, look, yes, we'll sign a truce with Japan and they can keep Hawaii, which wasn't even a state then, right? It was just a territory. So, I think the idea to call on him publicly or make those kind of statements is a little silly, because that obviously he can't do anything. And also, I would say, and I'll attest to, I'm not a master of military strategy, right? Whenever any of these wars break out, there's always all these people who played a lot of risk in the college lounge, and therefore think they're Napoleon in terms of the best way to carry out war. So I always try to avoid that. I mean, in that I don't have a realistic grasp on everything that's going on the ground, or what our capabilities are, what the Ukrainians' capabilities are, what the Russians' capabilities are. But I think you can say that Ukraine has outperformed expectations throughout this war, when most of the very smart people were saying, look, it's going to be over in 3 weeks. And then the very smart people were saying, look, it's going to be over in 3 months. And here we are. And then, well, it's the Ukrainian counteroffensive is bogged down. And well, wait a second, now they're grabbing Russian territory. So I'm always hesitant to just concede to the conventional wisdom. There was also a lot of conventional wisdom in the late 1930s that, look, Britain ought to cut the best deal it can, because that's just the way the dice are rolling, and that makes the most sense. So let me say, when I say, if we were to concede for the sake of argument that a negotiated settlement allowing Putin to hold some part of the Ukraine is probably the most likely geopolitical outcome. That's more a position for argument, as opposed to because I don't really know that that's the case. Zelensky may be able to continue to outperform. Again, I don't know enough to make those decisions, but that's sort of my caveat out there, right? That,
and I share the same caveat with you. I think they have. I think they've definitely outperformed what I ever would have expected. And one thing this highlights, I think, is that the Russian military is not in the fighting shape that I think outsiders thought it was. And I have a suspicion probably people in military intelligence knew this a little better than the layperson.
Exactly.
But, yeah. Again, I wasn't even a Risk player, so take this with as much salt as you need.
We're more an Axis and Allies guy, or more. Maybe you actually had like a social life in college.
Probably as opposed to less said about my college experience, the better, perhaps. But anyhow, but yeah, I think it does. I think a lot of this sort of comes down to in terms of cutting a deal, what are the odds of various outcomes, which I think are hard to know. And I think you have two people that are pretty dug in. I think that's kind of central to it, and then kind of the personalities of the two leaders in terms of cutting a deal. And yeah, I think it may be hard to settle this without conceding something, in terms of territory. I think it's also, going to be really hard to get the Ukrainians to cede any territory. And I have to think on some level that, rewarding Putin's behavior with anything is potentially problematic. I mean, not to, have to be careful with historical analogies, but he seemed to have, some real expansionist intent, in general. And I think if I were, sort of Eastern Europe, I'd be pretty concerned about, what happens if you give him, a little bit, is that enough disincentive to stop him from, trying this again, trying to push into, other territory, exactly. Et cetera.
Not everything is Munich, but some things are.
But some things are, and yeah, and it seems, again, I don't know Putin clearly, but it certainly seems like he has this sort of motivation to sort of, reunite the old Soviet Union, more or less, just under, new leadership, and that it's not going as well as one might have expected, or as I think he might have expected. But I think there is, for kind of the rest of Europe, there's probably solid reason for, the US and NATO and whatnot to try to keep that in check.
More than solid reason. I mean, it's sort of their purpose of existence, I would say, right? I mean,
I tend to undersell things, it's a local thing, but.
So let me turn on to a related issue, and that is um, Zelensky's, and you can call it injection of himself into American politics, or you can, I'm not sure what else you could, maybe you could call it American politicians' capture of Zelensky. Um, but this does present something that's a little unusual that we haven't seen much. And again, I tend to think just in the big historical sweep of picture, right? And what this almost reminds me of a little bit is what was going on in the 1790s up to the 1800s, which was the pseudo war with France. There was, as again, maybe I'm digging too deep into the weeds here. But England and France were at war, as they often were during that time, and everybody's impressing everybody else's ships and cutting off shipping. And it was a question of where does the U.S. stand in terms of, are we neutral? Are we Francophiles? Are we Anglophiles? And there was a faction, the Jeffersonian Republicans. This is one of the issues that brought them to the fore, was supporting France, revolutionary France, in its fight against the hated King George III. But it became a political issue, right? This is what ended up, with the passage of the Alien Sedition Acts, right? Was because you had sort of French agents sort of mucking around in American politics, trying to rouse up American support for France. Now, again, part of this is I just go into this because I like to digress on stuff from the late 1800s, but it's unusual in that so many of our other foreign wars, there was the idea that American foreign policy or American politics ended at our shores, and that we didn't take sides. But now we seem to have two of these going on. One, Israel and Hamas, where you have conservatives more in support of the Netanyahu government or the Israelis, depending on how you want to define that, versus this one. And I guess I'm looking for your thoughts on historical, either historical precedent or how do you just think this plays out? I mean, I think Zelensky, from a diplomatic standpoint, probably handled this poorly. But your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like you probably have the history of this better than I do in a lot of ways, but was not expecting a call out to the Alien and Sedition.
Well, no,
which I appreciate.
No. I apologize for that.
No need to apologize. I like this framing. So yeah, it's I think a couple things. I mean, one, it's sort of interesting to see foreign policy so much back on the table as an electoral issue. I know, back before I could vote, this was a huge defining issue. And then, it's been pretty domestic for a while. So to see it back, this way, but do you think foreign policy is on the table, or do you think this is just it's a lower signifier, right? This is just kind of a virtue signaling of, depending what flag you're going to fly, right? It's almost the same as putting up a yard sign. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think the average American couldn't find Ukraine on a map if you spotted them the first three letters, most of the time, at least prior to this. In fact, there's a great old survey question that they had people they gave them a map and had them put dots on where Ukraine was. And basically every country in the world except for Mexico had a dot on it from some survey respondent. It was just unreal. So that's it. I think you're right. I mean, this is probably kind of an epiphenomenon where it's just an expression of partisan stuff. On the other hand,
and it's also, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's a little different to say foreign policy in terms of, hey, we're providing aid and support to Israel or Ukraine, because it almost comes down to sort of a spending priority question as opposed to a foreign policy question, if you know what I mean. Maybe that's what I was trying to get at the first part. It's not.
Actually, that's where I was just about to go. This is. I think for Republicans at the moment, I mean, it's a nice way. It's a solid sort of rhetorical wedge to say, well, why are we sending this money, abroad when we have all these problems at home? Most of which they don't want to spend money on either,
Right.
to be fair. But
I, as a Republican, I'm sort of the position of I think we ought to be less interventionist at home and more interventionist abroad. But that's just me. So
very, very Eisenhower, sort of thing. But and I might take the opposite tack. But it seems to be that this is an easy way. Why are we spending money on this when our schools have these problems and there's homeless veterans and all that and as I always kind of reply to that, it's like, well, you've had plenty of opportunities to fund all of these other things and haven't, so, yeah. But it's a useful cudgel there, ultimately to it's a solid sort of, rhetorical strategy, if nothing else. I think in terms of the optics and stuff, one thing that I'm sort of struck by with this, just as I'm sort of thinking about this this morning, we generally don't get much from foreign leaders at all in terms of kind of shows of support, of candidates.
Nor should we, right? I mean, I guess I showed my hand there, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, setting aside the question of places that are actively shooting at each other, which I think amps the whole thing up a notch. We generally don't see anybody. Because we're pretty much the global superpower at this point and largely alone in that, I think they don't want to. They're going to have to work with whoever wins, and so, stay studiously out of it. And so, I do feel like, Zelensky a little bit here, given that his, kind of his political position is sort of tenuous, with regards to American parties and funding him. I'm not sure that it helps. I mean, I think clearly his sympathies lie with the Democrats, in terms of, just.
Sure.
It's pretty obvious. Trump's not going to. It's not obvious what Trump's going to do, but it's not going to be what he wants.
Right. And again, I think some people can make the argument that, well, at least Trump. Kamala Kamala Harris wouldn't do what he wants either. It's just Trump's being honest about it.
I think that, I mean, the challenge from both is, what exactly would they really do? I mean, I was back in the debate a couple of weeks ago, I thought the Ukraine answer, was like, well, I'd sit down with them and make a deal. And it's like, oh, congratulations, right. You've invented the summit, but without any sense of, where that would.
We just get everybody to sit down and talk. I'm sure it'll all work out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, but so, but I think, kind of anything that kind of looks like injecting himself there, I don't know that, that buys him a whole lot of, I'm not sure that it's helpful for his cause with the American electorate.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, I guess that's where then raises, to me, the other question is, whose idea was this? Whether it's his folks or whether there were Democrats talking to him, or I mean, one of the first rules of lobbying, and I've played a little bit in that world, and I travel with a lot of people who are in that world sort of full time. And this is going to sound very strange, right? Is that a lot of professional lobbyists tend to avoid politics to some extent. That sounds counterintuitive. But what I mean by that is if you're the spokesperson for the, whatever industry, the last thing in the world you want to do is go out on a political limb, a radical limb, attacking parties, presidential candidates who might be in power the next year. You typically take a studied approach, right? Of here's the folks we can work with, here's the folks we can't work with, and you lend your support judiciously in favor of them. Now, obviously, there's some lobbying groups that are so embedded in one side or the other that it's not going to make a difference.
My first thought was the NRA, but
like an ideological group like the NRA.
But that's and I
say like the National Soft Drink Association or something.
I was just going to say, I think that between kind of issue groups where there's a clear cut thing and business lobby that's, more agnostic on a lot of
and you can say something like the National Manufacturers Association certainly leans Republican, right? And a lot of their support or
but they freely acknowledge that, every so often they're going to have to work with
exactly, but they're not going to put out statements saying Kamala Harris is a communist, right? it's that sort of thing. Or they would be careful in if they're going to be staging events in a political battleground state that would be highly viewed. They would make sure that whatever event it is seen as bipartisan.
Right.
So I don't know whether it's just and it could well be, and Republicans were invited and didn't show or knew about it, just didn't show. And again,
given kind of the tenor of the Republican electorate, I'm not sure that they want to be seen with him at this point.
And look, I guess that's understandable. But in that case, I think if you're Zelensky, then you say, look, then I'm not doing it. Anyway, but these are sort of the inside sort of the stagecraft, right? That I tend to find fascinating. And if I were Zelensky, what I would, my approach would be rather than what he did, more of a Republican full court press, making that case there, right? On the assumption that, look, you've already got the Democrats. You're not going to get all the Republicans. You're not going to get J.D. Vance. You're not going to get Donald Trump, or who knows what you're going to get from Donald Trump, I guess. And Zelensky was meeting with him yesterday.
God only knows, yeah.
I don't know how that all turned out yet. I haven't heard from either of them, but and that would be my sense, is there probably would be other Republicans you could be reaching out to, and it could be he's doing so quietly, and we're just not hearing about it.
And that's possible that, he may be savvy enough to recognize that, hey, I'm going to need to give these folks some cover.
Yeah, exactly. And
I think it does.
Justin, you get it, man.
And I think, to kind of back to your lobbying analogy, I think, that is sort of that sensible place to put pressure. I think the kind of stereotype with lobbyists is they're just throwing money at, everybody and whatnot. And, I think there has to be this recognition that, look, there are some people that are kind of on the fence, and that's who you need to talk to. You've got camps that are for you and camps that are against you, and they're probably not going to move. But yeah, my suspicion, especially because I think this is such a, kind of the one policy area that I feel like Trump has really moved away from traditional Republican positions is foreign policy. I think a lot of his platform is pretty bog standard, in a lot of ways, but this is pretty different. And I think there are probably enough Republicans out there that aren't really full on MAGA and kind of that more old school position on foreign policy stuff, at least, that could well be persuadable.
Yeah. And maybe we're just we're in sort of a funny period where neither party is really articulating a foreign policy doctrine, right? Here's the plan. Here's what we stand for. It's, and it may look, it used to be easier, right? It used to be we're for containing communism or rolling back communism. We're for spreading democracy globally. We're against nation building, whatever, right? We're for sort of strategic intervention and upholding the international rule of law, a la, early 1990s Iraq War. But I don't know that any party has particularly articulated that. It's all been sort of we're kind of against aggression generally, and we'd probably do something about it, maybe. And I think that's part of, we live in maybe sort of confusing times.
Yeah, I think so. Where I would maybe disagree, I think the Democrats don't have a particularly clear vision. I have a fairly good sense of what they would do a lot of the time, but, in terms of articulating a philosophy, it's not there. But, I do think, again, maybe not the Republican Party writ large, but certainly for Trump, he's
Yeah,
pretty
the
explicit in
populist
being
MAGA,
an
yeah.
isolationist, so I mean, there is a vision there. It's just not a
Yeah.
maybe not a very realistic vision, just given the state of the world and kind of our role in it. But
Right. And I think maybe that's something. It's one thing. Isolationism tends to be sort of easy to preach, but more difficult to practice because the world tends to intervene on you whether you want to be isolated or not. If anyone like has ever personally tried isolationism, right? Just man, I wish people would just leave me alone for a day. I mean, try it. It just doesn't work. I mean, because events happen and there are other people in the world. So, and it's not as even in the isolationism of for example, the late 1800s, when George Washington advised against entangling alliances and so forth. It was a lot easier when everybody was an ocean away, and an ocean away meant a couple weeks in a boat that might or may not even make it. Or even in the 1920s, isolationism, where we were far less intertwined, and you couldn't cross the ocean in a plane, much less cross it with hypersonic missiles. So.
And I think, in terms of what our needs and incentives are too, if you think back to the Washington period, I mean, as a fragile young nation,
yeah, and largely agrarian. Yeah.
There's a good reason to stay out of those things. I mean, I'm always struck, in that period, if you think of all of the kind of, democracies that flame out, fairly quickly, it's pretty impressive that we navigated that. And I think that would have been one way to really muck it up.
And of course, this whole, English-French conflict was exactly what Washington was talking about.
Right.
At the time, it wasn't just a matter of supporting so-and-so in such and such a place.
Well, we should probably pivot to.
We probably should. Justin, I appreciate you because when Mike's not here and I sort of run the show, I'm terrible at time management because I just kind of wander on and,
We are probably, when it comes to keeping things on track, we might be the two worst people to put together for that. I mean, I can ramble for all morning. So anyway, but. It's good talk, though. I'm happy. There's no clear stopping place. So, but want to talk a little bit about Harris visiting the border yesterday. I feel like there's a certain kind of parallelism here, just in terms of the intersection of policy and campaigning. So, Harris was at the border in Arizona yesterday on a campaign stop. Obviously, Arizona is a tight presidential state right now that's leaning a little bit Republican. And, this border issue and immigration has been, I think, a challenging spot for Harris and Democrats, in general. It's certainly one of Trump's, big issues. It's in some ways one of the few he takes a particularly clear stand on, I feel like. And it's one that
there we have some solid foreign policy stands. Yeah. And,
again, thinking back to the debate a couple of weeks ago, I mean, everything is immigration. Whatever the question is, the answer is stopping immigration. And Trump has been favored on this, generally speaking, in polling, again, to the extent that this is a priority for people, which is maybe something we can talk about in a minute. Though it seems that lead is narrowing a little bit. In terms of, what she had to say, she basically criticized Trump for blocking the bipartisan border bill last year, said that she'd, revive it and sign it. It's largely a compromise position that gives sort of everybody something that they want. There's kind of increased border security, but also potentially paths to citizenship for some undocumented people that are already here. Thoughts on this, I guess. How does this play politically? Is it one of those too little, too late sort of things? Is it, we can talk policy, et cetera, and I'm just going to stop rambling and.
Yeah. No, so I think to me, it strikes me as sort of just it's bizarre. I don't know that it moves the needle one way or the other for Americans in general. I think Arizonans might be a little put off by it. in terms of well, now here she is, whether she was border czar or not. Clearly, this has been a problem, and recent figures released by ICE just last week also indicate that there's a significant non-citizen crime problem going on in the country that Arizonans and border states have been peculiarly aware of, right? So I think her showing up and saying, well, if Donald Trump, who wasn't in office at the time, hadn't rejected this proposal, which I think fairly a lot of Republicans could argue, me among them, wouldn't have done much. It just would have, expanded the so-called, welcoming committee. We'd still be bringing folks in, releasing them. There would be the option to close the border at some point. But I think a lot of folks would say, well, why isn't the border, presumptively closed to those who don't have the legal right to cross? So no, I don't think it gets her a whole lot. I don't know that it hurts her. It does. I don't know that it changes the dynamic one way or the other. It's almost Republicans get the headline. Kamala Harris finally visits the border, and she can at least now say, well, look, I'm trying to do something. So I think it's, did she have to do it at some point? Yeah, but. Does it move things one way or the other? No. Yeah, I think that's my take on it. And again, it's this weird sort of position that Harris is in running in sort of as sort of the candidate of hope and change. When some right-wing media sources continue to report that she's actually the sitting vice president. But, I don't know. It's working in some quarters. So.
Yeah, well, sitting vice president, was it John Nance Garner who said it's not worth a cup of warm spit, the vice presidency?
Yeah, well, yeah, true. So I think and you can make that argument, but it's a terrible argument to make while you're the vice president running for
exactly,
president, right?
Exactly. Apparently, John Nance Garner had not a whole lot of presidential.
Exactly. Where's John Nance Garner today, right?
Well, time gets us all, I suppose. But anyhow, yeah, I think this is one of those areas. She's been criticized on this for forever. In terms of not going to the border and. I think as a symbolic thing, it's important. It's one of those things where, in terms of kind of having an interest in governance and also an interest in optics, as a practical consideration, I always thought it was pretty dumb that, it's, oh, why isn't she at the border?
I'm with, let me just say, I'm with you 100% on that. Yeah. And this will sound weird. And in some ways, maybe I'm not a good politician because sometimes my political instincts, in some cases, would be terrible. But yeah, I'm not one of these people who think that, if she'd only visit the border, that would change things. I think it's symbolic that you ought to show that, if this is a priority, you're going to make the time to show up and address that. Sure. But does it give you any special expertise or anything? Does it make the situation any better than doing something from sitting inside the old executive office building in DC? I don't think so. Likewise, I'm always critical about the whenever there's some natural disaster, and we have the hurricane now, and I'm sure there's going to be Republicans who are going to be calling of, where's Biden? Why don't we drop him in the middle of some hurricane devastation, because that will really help. I'm not a fan of the showing up and pass out a few water bottles for the political optics, and my sense has always been on these kind of things that a lot of times it just makes life more difficult for the people on the ground who are actually doing the job. So other people see political value in it. So I'm sorry to interrupted, but I wanted to say that, look, you're not alone in that. that view.
It's one of those moments again where I feel like they're, throwing the liberal and conservative in here, we don't get as many sparks as you would expect at these things. But yeah, and I think, but my other thought, I always go to like, Ted Cruz playing dress up and, taking a boat across the Rio Grande or whatever.
Yeah.
In his GI Joe costume, and but I think the symbolism of these things, and that's where I'm more of a campaigns guy and less of a policy guy, professionally, and so I think these things are important. One of the real challenges here is when you're a candidate, we expect candidates to address this whole plethora of issues, and there are often times where, it's strategic to not talk about things where you're not favored. Try to shift the emphasis onto things that people like you on. And it's much easier to do that. It's very hard to sort of convince people that don't like you on a policy that hey, you should like my position. It's a lot easier to get them to think about something that they like you on rather than something they don't. We call this priming in political communication, and I'm not even going to go down the rabbit hole of the naming of that. But anyway,
you should.
So it's misnamed. It's like psychological concept originally, and it's basically presupposing a certain sort of cognitive process and blah, 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 blah. But I guess where I'm going, with this. To talk about the definition a little bit, at least the way that we use it, even if I think it's named wrong, basically when a communication source, whether it's a media outlet, which is where we mostly study this, or candidates can do this. I had an article a long time ago with Jamie Druckman about this with presidential speeches. Basically, the more an issue gets talked about, the more important people think it is, and this is one of those sorts of hypotheses, but you need to test it and whatnot. But there is some evidence, and we found some evidence that candidates and elected officials can do this too, to an extent. I mean, they're a player in this, and they've got strategic reasons that they'd want to talk about some things over others. So and I don't think any of this is rocket science, by any stretch. But it's one of those things that there's a lot of research on this because we want to probe the nuances of it. And even things that are common sense, you need to actually verify that, they do what they do. But I think, that's a challenge in being a presidential candidate, because we have this expectation that you speak to everything. You look like you're insensitive if you're not speaking to issues that people care about. But there's a strong incentive here, if you're a presidential candidate, to talk about not that. If this is something where you're favored by your opponent's favored by 15 points or wherever we're at this point, the strong incentive would be to go talk about some other issue, pivot to it's a great time to talk about abortion.
Right, exactly. No, that was exactly where I was going to go.
Because I was kind of it's like, I probably don't want to talk about the economy too much. So go to those places where you're favored. And again, that's this sort of tension between governance and the strategy as well. But even the strategy is kind of hard here. So yeah, I mean, I tend to think that this doesn't move much, and just the headlines as I'm seeing this, I mean, it's very, even the more centrist, sorts of outlets, hell, even the slightly liberal leaning ones, they always get the Trump criticism in there. It's always framed in the first paragraph as this has been a perpetual problem for Democrats and Harris in particular, so I'm not sure that bringing it up helps, but then at the same time, you can, you'd be getting the story anyway. That's, why is she not there? Why doesn't she care?
Well, I think to some extent there's also, you're familiar with Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's comment when asked about what the greatest challenge of being a statesman, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I think there's something to that there are sometimes issues that might not be good for you, but they are so big that you can't ignore them. And I think immigration is one of them, particularly if you're in and look, maybe you could ignore it in Pennsylvania. But I don't think you can ignore it. You can go to Pennsylvania and make some great speeches about reproductive freedom and defending democracy and all that. But I think it's a little harder to sell in Arizona, um, where they're they're believe you or they're lying eyes, right? And I think and the same can be true for, say, inflation, right? It's big enough that it's making a big enough difference to a whole lot of people that the economy is not a great issue for Democrats in this cycle. But yet you can't just not say anything about it, lest you get the look, they're so out of touch, they're not even acknowledging these issues. So I think that's a big part of it as well. I think this she's bowing to events.
Yeah, and so couple thoughts. I think your central point is spot on. In terms of sometimes the world intercedes.
I usually am, but
there's just not much to help there. I do think immigration. I mean, I think it plays differently in different places. I think in Arizona, there's obviously going to be a bigger deal. In the border states. I do think that in terms of the prominence here, writ large, I mean, I think it has been whipped up to an extent, with the caveat that, yes, I think, you need to do some things with border security and whatnot. I think Trump's concern and a lot of the Republicans' public's concern, I think is out of whack with my concern, but I think in terms of the the kind of national issue, I think it's somewhat overblown and has been whipped up. Again, not that you shouldn't do some things, and I think we have a lot of problems around immigration. I kind of like the bipartisan bill, before, but. It does sort of play everywhere. I mean, Trump was in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, which isn't all that far from here, and that was his big theme. And it's pretty hard to cross the border into Prairie du Chien. You can cross the Iowa border into Prairie du Chien, but that's not the kind of immigration they're worried about. There, I don't think. But I think where Trump has been successful is parlaying this into a national issue.
Yeah.
In places where it just doesn't have a lot of impact.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm going to sort of try to answer that. And I think there could be typical Democrats who could come up with other answers and say, well, that's because all Republicans are racist, and hate the any dark-skinned people coming into the country anywhere and so forth. I don't think that's the case at all. I'm not saying that isn't the case somewhere. Or that some people's feelings on immigration aren't based on race. But I think more from the bigger picture, why it plays in places like Wisconsin is the sense of lawlessness or versus lawfulness, in the argument that, listen, the Democrats, and I mentioned this, and Mike and I had this discussion of the the what's wrong with you people a couple of weeks ago. And one thing that I mentioned is that Republicans tend to be the party of rules, and Democrats tend to be the party of feelings. And I think there is a sense of that Republicans they say, well, look, don't we have rules, laws that they're not supposed to just be able to come into the country? And the response is, well, yeah, but it's pending asylum requests, and authors all going to get turned down. Yeah, well, probably, but they're presidential paroled, and this is interesting. And again, this is Mike would take me to task because this is an anecdote and not data. But I've brought this guy up before. My friend Ariel, who runs the Thai restaurant near where I work, and I'm a frequent patron. If you're near Independence, Ohio, Thai Gourmet, I recommend it highly. But Ariel, who is a legal immigrant, came here, built his own business from the ground up, works probably 48 hours a day. Has brought up to me, along with my pad thai, that he has some serious issues with Biden's immigration proposal simply because everything he went through. And he talked about how it took years and years and years for him to get his wife over to this country because he was following the legal process. And then to see, well, these folks, well, we're going to kind of waive the rules for them. There's a sense of unfairness that I think that plays throughout the country, even if they don't see a direct economic impact of immigration.
And I think,
in my view, the economic impact tends to be positive.
Yeah, there's actually some studies
if done correctly. Yeah.
Even if done incorrectly, I actually saw a study that actually identity theft and social security numbers is actually shoring up social security for an additional year, more or less, people paying in that can't get it. But I've seen some of that too. Certainly with Latino immigrants as well. Legal immigrants have some problems here with the fairness. I think I would push back a little bit, on the how much of that is driving. I think that's a part of the story, but there, some of the way that these are talked about. I mean, if you look at like the Haitians, sure. They're legal and everybody's mad at them, at this point. And I think some of the especially the Trump inflected version of this. And so again, I'm perhaps giving some Republicans an out here. I mean, there are lots of ways that you can come to a policy position, but an awful lot of it is sort of they're taking our culture, they're changing our country, et cetera, which, is kind of on my mind. There's a excerpt from a Samuel Huntington book on this that I use in my intro American classes. That kind of very much this sort of argument, is that, well, American culture is its thing, and we don't want people coming and changing it, and and whether or not that's racist or not is a story for another day, I suppose. But I think there is I think that's a bigger component. I think sometimes
yeah. Well, I made the point, and you're not wrong there. And I think there's you can make an issue of a country needs to some extent some cultural cohesion. And
that's very much the Huntington argument. Yeah.
But that doesn't, and I think you can, there's a point at which that drifts from, desiring cultural cohesion into nativism or racism or something like that. I think I guess I would sort of view that on sort of a spectrum, right? I made the point a couple weeks ago talking with Mike that if you took 20,000 Clevelanders and plopped them in some French village, there would be some upheaval. Right? Just again, culture clash from two different places, and there might be people in that French village who are not appreciative of some of our ways of barking like dogs on Sunday afternoons and so forth. But again, there would be a culture clash. And I don't think it's racist in any way to recognize that. And again, I'm talking about, so taking a bunch of people from the Midwest and dropping them in Western Europe, where the cultures are really pretty comparable. There's that inevitable friction in immigration, and to some extent, that's why, again, the Republican position, my position is it needs to be managed effectively, so that friction doesn't overcome the good of having my buddy come in who's opening the Thai restaurant.
Yeah, and I guess I sort of take the long game on this, to some extent, which is we've had these arguments forever, essentially. Yeah,
Benjamin Franklin was very concerned about too many Germans in Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
Pennsylvania was losing its Englishness because of the Germans.
Yeah, and the damn dirty Irish, and so on
Yeah.
and so forth. That my students.
Don't get me
always
started on the Polish.
Yeah.
But
There is still Polish language AM radio in Chicago, actually.
oh, they're still in here in Cleveland, I believe.
Is there really? I'll be
Yeah.
darned.
Oh, we have all kinds of. I can tell you a great story of back in my legislative days of going to war with the folks at public radio to defend the Slovenian hour and the polka shows that used to be on public radio that NPR found kind of déclassé these days. But that's a story for another day. But no. I there are.
But I think my general feeling is again I think these are real, in terms of, in terms of a question. And yeah, I pity the French with the 20,000 Clevelanders coming over and then, that upheaval. I'm sure Clevelanders are lovely people.
Maybe Iowans would treat them better. Yeah.
Yeah, but but I think broadly speaking, I think culture is in flux and it's changed over time, and anyhow, but we probably should move on again.
We can also, sometimes we could also. God, I'd love to have like a conversation about culture, because I think that's something that's huge. And is often misunderstood, and
that would be a really interesting kind of bonus show sometime. We should, maybe next time we do this, we should focus on that, because that's actually.
Have you ever read any of Spengler's Decline of the West? Well, it's funny because it talks about culture in a very different way, and than the way we're talking about it. That so often culture isn't just here's the food you eat, the customs you have, the holidays you celebrate, your folk ways, so to speak. But it's more these sort of systemic ways of looking at sort of the universe, even, right? It's like how you think about math, how you think about space, how you and in large part, I'm really digressing now. Our cultures are sort of pretty similar. Between Mexico, Central America, South America, and the U.S. But in other ways, I think that there are still differences. But that's something else, and we should keep on moving, because that's
we should back burner that, because I feel like that could actually we could do a whole thing on that sometime. That would be pretty interesting.
Gertrude Himmelfarb is the other person to read on culture. But go ahead. What we got next, Justin? Oh, it's me.
Yeah, it's you. We've got two scandals that maybe we can.
So our first scandal is
we have a traditional one and a less traditional one.
Yeah. So our first scandal is New York Mayor Eric Adams was indicted, becoming the first major city mayor. Well, first New York mayor. I'm trying to think how they phrase this under indictment. For some of his cultural outreach with the Turkish community, and vice versa. Adams was indicted for allegedly accepting bribes from the Turkish government, Turkish nationals. And as it looks to be, this indictment, it's more than just the Turks, but that seems to be the gravamen of it, at least at this point. Basically doing city favors for money, approving buildings for fire approvals and so forth that shouldn't have been approved, accepting in return trips, money, stays at fancy hotels. It was said that Eric Adams, who seems to travel a lot for New York mayor, certainly more than I do, spent a lot of time going to, routing all his flights through Istanbul, not Constantinople, to all places throughout the world, and putting stays in Turkey, and just a general weirdness to it. But it doesn't look good for Adams or his administration at this point, with the caveat that all of the folks on our show are innocent until proven guilty. But the facts, as alleged, don't paint a pretty picture.
Yeah, I'll just start with an aside, but having been to the Istanbul airport, I don't know that I would want to route my flights through there for the most part. It's not one of my favorites. So Yeah, I think this is in some ways, somebody who grew up in Illinois. This is a very comfortable and familiar feeling scandal to me. This is just part and parcel of how things go down. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see this kind of shake out. In part, I mean, I think, in big city politics, I mean, some of these things, I mean, they're better than they used to be, but I think there's still kind of a wink and a nod,
Oh yeah.
about some of this stuff. And, I think travel and things like that, I mean, it's enough of a gray area that, a lot of it flies under the radar, a lot of the time. Which is to say, well, I'm normalizing it. Good for them for going after him, ultimately. I mean, I am a clean government type, and I think that if somebody is sort of shaking down the office, well, there should be consequences. And again, with the strong caveat that I haven't seen the evidence and I'm not a jury, and
numerous Democrats, including Nadler, AOC, a lot of New York Democrats have called for his resignation, which again, that's maybe to me not surprising, right? Because Adams wasn't necessarily
he was
progressive favorite.
No, not
so I think there's a sense of they're happy to throw him under the bus as opposed to if he was someone more useful. But
yeah, to the extent that I closely follow New York City politics from Iowa, but yeah, the sense that I've had from kind of the bulk of Democrats was, the chatter that I see is that nobody particularly wanted him, on the Democratic side in the first place. So it certainly makes him easier to throw under the bus. I do wonder. I mean, he's it's a young scandal, so we'll see how this plays out. But, I do sort of wonder if that loss of support right away, I mean, AOC doesn't have any actual sway over him, I suppose, but if everybody abandons you, which actually will be a Mark Robinson theme in a minute, if everybody abandons you at some point, that's going to make it awfully hard to stay in office, regardless of how the judicial process shakes out.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think to some extent he has the Al Franken problem, right? In that he is easily replaceable. I mean, again, Democrats had Al Franken, the former SNL.
Oh, well aware. Yeah.
Cast member. No, I'm just for our listeners who might be.
Oh, yes,
younger.
Yes.
Yeah.
He
I know you get all my
for a while.
pop culture references, but.
Well, he was my senator, for a while. So,
and was actually funny, I thought, on SNL. Much less funny as a senator, and accused of inappropriate behavior, groping women, and was called out on this. And the Democratic establishment sort of immediately threw him under the bus, and much to sort of his surprise, I think, and he resigned. And I think to me the conventional wisdom there is, well, of course, you can always get another Democratic senator from Minnesota. Likewise, you can always get another Democratic mayor, most likely one that is perhaps better liked in the first place in New York. So I don't know that
it's not such a moral stand, or not so hard to take a moral stand, in those circumstances. I will say, Minnesota politics at that time, I mean, he had replaced Norm Coleman, if I'm not mistaken, and it wasn't necessarily a slam dunk in the way that New York City mayor would be, but I take your point.
Minnesota's weird though, and I took heat, I think, a couple of weeks ago, on to the extent I read the internet criticism stuff. To me, it's kind of like there's always these few. It's like immediately after we post the show, it's like the two guys on the Muppet Show, up in the box, right? So I just kind
of and Waldorf,
kind of tune them out, but. But no, I referred to Minnesota as the San Francisco of the Midwest, So you can interject your comments.
Yeah, so
if you have any, having lived there.
I have a lot. In fact, careful listeners will notice that I dropped the phrase "hot dish" a minute ago in conversation. Which, so I lived there for about a decade in Minneapolis. Went to grad school up there. So, it's actually I've used San Francisco, the Midwest, to describe Minneapolis.
Okay, fair, yeah.
To a lesser extent, St. Paul, and to no extent, kind of outside of that. But yeah, I mean, it's, Minneapolis and largely St. Paul, pretty darn liberal, pretty LGBT friendly, et cetera, very, very progressive. It's a fantastic place to live. If I could go back there, I would in a heartbeat. But
I spent about 2 weeks in Minneapolis in a trial years ago, and I liked it.
You have the good fortune to go in June or February.
Well, it was like July.
So that's a good time to be there.
It was just kind of like humid and sticky.
The mosquitoes are huge also.
Yeah. And in fairness, I mean, I feel bad. I basically saw from the hotel to the courthouse and back, but
right.
That was nice enough.
Yeah. It's one of those places where visiting is less exciting. Like, it doesn't necessarily have a ton of attractions, but like just being there is quite pleasant. But but there's a huge divide, and I mean, that's, Walls didn't win by all that much. There's a huge kind of metro versus outstate divide, as there is everywhere with cities, more or less. And I think to some extent it's just that the outstate areas of Minnesota are so scantily populated that they don't kind of have a fighting chance. There has been kind of a shift in the suburbs there, actually, in a more democratic direction, which is also a fairly common thing. But I remember in 2008 when the returns came back from Edina that Obama had won. It's like, well, this is a giant thing. Edina is a really affluent suburb. But anyway, boy, we've gone far afield here.
Yeah.
But anyhow,
I actually bumped into Garrison Keillor on the streets of New York one time, but.
Speaking of somebody with
that's again completely off topic. So,
to bring it full circle, there is strong parallels between his ouster from Prairie Home Companion and Al Franken's ouster from the Senate.
Yeah, what's up?
Very similar problems. Although I
cold
argue
weather,
Garrison,
the Viking
Garrison Keillor was arguably less replaceable. Anyhow. Well, should we move on to
please, because this other scandal was also. Yes, as you would say, less. One seems to be sort of a dog bites or man bites or dog bites man's scandal. This one seems to be the other kind.
Yeah, in fact, I think when we were kind of batting these around back and forth, I believe after all the other scandals we've dealt with, it feels good to be talking about a traditional one, and now we're going to go 100% the opposite way. I have had to be very delicate with the language here because this one is
better you than me, right?
Well, I was the one that suggested this, and then holy cow! Other kind of budding scandal here that's been unfolding. This kind of blew up about 8-9 days ago now. Is in the North Carolina governor's race. So North Carolina Republican Mark Robinson basically has this scandal. Somebody found an old account of his on an adult website and appears to be pretty solidly connected to him, like he used his own name signing up, used his own email address, used his don't do these things in general, but used his own email address, used a username that he used on other websites, etc. And
Lieutenant Governor 69. No, they died to making that up, people. I'm sorry.
Oh, but it's so good. So anyhow, the bigger issue here is not that the guy's on adult websites, but this website had a discussion board, which is where this goes extremely weird. And apparently for a period, he was a frequent poster on this discussion board. And basically, the variety of choice comments that he posted, he described himself as a black Nazi. He is African-American, to be fair. A perv, called for the reinstatement of slavery, told a heartwarming story about being a peeping Tom when he was a teenager, et cetera. And it goes on and on and on. So
He also said he was very much into trans porn.
I didn't want to go there, but yes,
well, I think it's important to address.
I think it is important, actually. Yeah. So, and to be fair, to not yuck anybody's yum, it's the hypocrisy I think that he's been, called out on more specifically. So, going through this, then. He was a Trump-backed candidate. He had national backing. This is a race that was going to be very tight. It's a focal point for sort of.
But should have leaned Republican.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's it was a tight race. I think enough money was flowing into it that it looked like it was anyway. Should lean Republican is very much not now. So recent polling just out kind of end of this week has him losing 53-36 now. Trump was in North Carolina, didn't mention him. All of his campaign staff quit, more or less. RNC pulled his money, et cetera. So I guess a couple thoughts here, just to get beyond the. I have to admit, a good sex scandal also gets my attention, having lived through the Clinton years, and but to think kind of in terms of political relevance here, I think the couple questions, how does something like this slip through the cracks? First of all, I mean, we do a lot of vetting of candidates, presumably before they go, and then so are there broader implications? I mean, it certainly looks like North Carolina is going to have a Democratic governor, but this is also a pretty tight swing state, So over to you.
Does it affect Trump? So I'll respond first. And Justin, for decades, Republicans have been accused of running plain white males for offices, and here we finally nominate someone, a black Nazi trans porn aficionado. And you just can't win.
He ticks all of our DEI boxes, I suppose.
No, my sense is that this is a problem with the MAGA populist Trump movement. Is that they have tended to find these candidates who are, for lack of a better term, weirdos. But they're fighters. They're fighters. They're going to fight for you. And I think that's been a problem of, you've had a number of candidates throughout a whole lot of places. I'm not going to name names, but we mention them frequently on this show, some in Congress, some in state offices, some who assassinate dogs. But this weird sort of thing of people who, under other circumstances, would have gone through the running for city council and state representative and all those sort of things, and had some vetting before they got to these higher levels. And to some extent, I suppose he's had some experience, but that's I think, to me, is the problem. Is there was this new sort of MAGA movement that swept in a lot of candidates without a whole lot of looking at who the candidates are. And in fact, I could even say there's maybe a little self-selection of the weirdos by this, because it's a matter of sometimes you have folks who could not have made it through the regular processes, right? But all of a sudden, we're hey, there's a parade here that I can get in on, and my sense is he is one of those. And Trump is not great about vetting candidates. It's sort of a matter of, if they swear fealty to him, well, that's good enough.
Yeah. I take it actually a little further back. The first, as you were talking and then not naming names, I'm going to go ahead and name a name, which is Christine O'Donnell in Delaware.
Oh, yeah. Which?
Yeah, well, according to her ad, she's not a witch. Actually, I run that ad in class.
See, I take that back, right?
I run that ad in class for just giggles, mostly. But, my point is, if you have to run an ad that says you're not a witch, you're in a lot of trouble. But I mean, that she kind of was part of the Tea Party wave, which I think in some ways, kind of anticipates, the MAGA. But I think it's that same story, where,
right. It's the outsiders.
This absolute outsider.
The witches, the black Nazis.
Yeah. She was an anti-masturbation activist at one point, supposedly, which I was not aware was a thing either, but I digress.
Right.
All of these things I didn't even know were things.
Big tent.
Big tent. Yeah. Big tent. Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with you that with the populism thing, I mean, this appears to be not helpful, to put it mildly, as far as electability. But yeah, I think it does sort of, by taking it outside of that traditional vetting process, I think you do run the risk of this. I am sort of curious how this turned up, actually. Like, it was a fairly obscure, like the way it was described, I will say, I'm not sure if a normal vetting process would have caught this right away.
Right. It could have been someone inside leaked or something.
Well, that's a good.
That would be my guess.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because it was not a mainstream adult content site as I understand them. So how you would find this in the first place, how you know to go looking there in particular.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe there's a way you can crawl the web for usernames or something like that. Might be, how they got him, but. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, and maybe gets to, some of the weakness of the parties at this point, in the current, sort of environment. If you are, certainly we've conceded the selection of candidates largely to the primary process, but parties still traditionally have had a fairly good hand at picking, who those folks are. And we've gotten to a point now where, at least kind of on the Republican side, in some races, the traditional party structure doesn't have a lot of ability there to really have much influence, and so this is some of that the degradation of that process. I think.
I think this goes back to, because I like to talk about the stuff that nobody else talks about,
and I'm here for it.
Witches and black Nazis aside, but no, that is, I do think the Democrats tend to have a much tighter control over their primary process, over their nominating process, than what Republicans do. And I think here's one of those places where it shows up.
And I think, because
as I see, there's a lot of times you'll see Democratic office holders who you can have some of these, let's call them weirdos, again at the lower levels, local levels, but they tend to get weeded out before they get to the state level. At least that's my experience. Now again, you've got some sort of local, like in your AOCs and so forth, that have a weird sort of ideological thing. But even AOC, she's a goofy leftist, but she's not. She's not
a black Nazi.
I would say she's not. she's not these folks.
Right. I mean, she's, she is within the normal parameters,
Yeah.
She's on the
she's on the far left side of the spectrum, but
far left side of the spectrum, but she's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I guess I would just say, if you had any thoughts or comments or any like research on that, but I think that's something
I do.
that I've seen, right?
Not that I've done. So actually this what some of this, I like that you took it to kind of other levels, because I think there's a kind of a gap in research there. There is research on presidential elections, and this is fresh on my mind because I'm just teaching this last week. So there was a book, and it's 4 or 5 authors, and I'm not going to name them because I'm not going to get all of them. It was called The Party Decides, which was kind of the big book on kind of partisan influence on primaries. Mm-hmm. So, the story here is, the parties cede control after 68. So 72, they cede control to the public by shifting over to doing these, primaries and making them binding and whatnot. And, the rules change, and there have been some safety valves built in and stuff. But what they find is that, by and large, in presidential races, at least, you pretty much get who the party wanted. Even though, this is a hard counterfactual, of course, but you get somebody that generally speaking, the party elites would tend to focus on, or would have probably picked anyway, or would have at least been acceptable.
Yeah.
And pretty much their story is that it all comes down to endorsements. So essentially, if you count up the endorsements that candidates get, the candidate that gets the most endorsements ends up being the nominee. And that is a consistent pattern, basically up through, I'm trying to think where I can't think where their data analysis stops, maybe 2008, maybe 12. It's also true in 12, whether or not that's whether or not that's part of their book. And this was a book that kind of a lot of anti-Trump Republicans were trotting out in 16 as, oh, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
As Trump's surging, we've got this academic book, and maybe we don't like academics very much, but they've got data, and it's going to be okay. There's no universe where Trump's going to be the nominee.
Right.
And
how that data work out for you? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So for my campaigns and elections class, this is going to be one of the short answer questions. Why didn't it work in 2016? Is kind of the story. And there's a couple different.
And I guess my question, and we're not going to have time to answer it all today, but yeah, as it seems to be, what I'm saying is I think you tend to get more of these. So let's call them insurgencies. That's probably not the best word for it, but in the Republican world than you do in the Democratic world, just because I think there is just much less party discipline. Again, that's my theory, unsupported by any data. Other than my data is Mark Robbins as lieutenant governor and Donald Trump is the presidential candidate.
Yeah, well, we've got ANIC data. So, I mean, this would be, I think that kind of expanding this out, this would be an interesting study. I think there has been, I think Trump is a shift a little bit here. And one thing, kind of to go back to their book, they are, in terms of who they call the party, they take this really broad view. It's not just kind of the national parties, but it's kind of aligned interest groups and various influentials and stuff. And I do wonder if, and part of my criticism of that book a little bit is that it's kind of post hoc in terms of who they're calling a meaningful endorsement, a little bit, if you're, it's kind of hard to circumscribe that universe without being circular. But I do wonder if, some of this is that on the right, power has kind of shifted away from the party, but there are other people whose sort of endorsements matter, who are influential, who can sort of pump people up.
Sure. The Sean Hannitys of the world.
I was going to go with Cat Turd, but he's just my favorite go-to because of the name. Yeah, but he's got a couple million followers on X, formerly known as Twitter. So, to the extent that, I think you're right. I mean, the party apparatus, I think on the Republican side does seem to be weaker now. Maybe going back to Christine O'Donnell, to go sort of full circle with this.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back further than that, but yeah, that's for that. So one, because again, we're you and I have incredibly blown our time constraints. Probably
we're not as bad as we usually are, but we should probably.
But I guess my last question is your thoughts as a political scientist, as a professor, on how this affects the presidential election, if it does at all.
My suspicion is not a lot. I think the potential theory here would be that certain races can drive turnout in ways that impact others, would be, kind of your standard story. So nothing, I don't think anybody that would have voted for Trump is not going to hold the Robinson endorsement against him. I don't think that's a thing. The concern would be, were there Republicans who Robinson would have been pulling out, who might be a little reluctant to enter the electorate this time around, and while they're there, also end up voting for Trump. And I'm not sure that this is going to be as big of a deal. I think there have been moments in time where this is a thing. Back in the 2002, 2004, there was a perspective that I think was kind of backed by some insider stuff that, Karl Rove was pushing to get a lot of anti-gay
ballot issues,
issues on there to turn out.
And I think ballot issues are something different than candidates.
Yeah, so there is evidence of kind of a coattails effect, in years where kind of one party does well in the presidential race, everybody does well. And, some of that's probably just environment and some of it might be this turnout story. But I think here, if anything, that story would probably have been Trump pulling out people that incidentally vote for Robinson rather than Robinson.
Exactly. No, I think you're right. And
Trump.
Again, I, as always, do this without any data or anything like that. But no, that's my sense as well. And
I'm speculating too, just to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent, we necessarily are speculating because
these are one of those things where, God, I wish that doing surveys wasn't so blasted expensive, because I'd love to have, I've got a questionnaire in my head that's formulating right now because I'm a giant nerd. But like, it's an answerable question, I think, but it's a question that we don't have the data to answer,
right.
Unfortunately.
And also it's a lieutenant governor candidate, and it's not a, sitting. I mean, I think, does it help Trump? No, it really doesn't help. Because it takes away that, the joint appearances and the joint rallies and all that kind of fun stuff.
I mean, he was coming
but I would tend to agree with you. I don't think it changes the presidential race significantly. Now, if it's is super close as it might be, well, maybe those a couple of percentages of a point might make the difference. And
that's always been my position. In a 1 point race, everything matters. And so, if North Carolina comes down to close enough, it could. I do wonder if it. Again, I think this is a fairly unlikely thing. But if we're talking about fractions of a point here and there adding up, could there be a blowback with a handful of independents that might have leaned Trump and or honked off or something? Anything's possible, but in terms of raw numbers,
that's why I think, just again, this is without any data. I think where the ballot issues make more of a difference, because it does bring out independents who might not otherwise show up at the polls and would then cast a ballot for one candidate or the other. Whereas I don't think this does.
And with the ballot initiatives too, I mean, kind of with evangelical voters, the question is largely not who are they going to vote for. It's just making sure they show up, and so giving them something to show up for. So, and I think this is, I was kind of looking for an analogous situation. I think this is enough different that, I don't think it works here, is my suspicion, but.
So, all right. Well, thank you for listening. If you stuck with us this far, then we appreciate it. If there's anything you discussed on the show that you really disagreed with, although I think that would be hard to find, or that you have a question about, or that you really liked, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is at mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X, which is, formerly known as something else. Links are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forum supporters, which Mike is on all the time. I am not because I don't love you guys, but just because the law is a jealous mistress. If you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, we hope you'll consider becoming one to help us keep the show going strong. As a supporter, you will get ad-free versions of everything we release, the full-length midweek podcast instead of just a preview, access to our Politics Guys Discord group, where you can interact with Mike, Trey, and other listeners. And you'll even have the opportunity to listen in and comment as we record shows, which we've done that sometimes, and it is really fun. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. If a monthly Patreon contribution is too much of a commitment, you've got issues with Patreon, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, we have PayPal and Venmo support options too. You'll find links to all their support options at politicsguys.com/support in the show notes. And if you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email Mike at politicsguys.com, and he'll be happy to get you set up with that. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as share episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.